I didn't vanish in a dramatic way. No final argument. No slammed door. No goodbye note folded with shaking hands. I simply stopped showing up. If you're listening to this, you probably imagine disappearance as an act of courage or madness. A single moment where someone breaks and runs. But that's not how it happened for me. I didn't run. I eroded. Slowly. Quietly. Like a shoreline losing itself grain by grain until one day the map no longer recognizes it. The truth is, I had a life that looked complete from the outside. A job people respected. A routine that made sense. Conversations that followed familiar tracks. I knew what to say when someone asked how I was doing. I knew how to smile in the right places. I knew how to nod at the right moments. I was fluent in the language of being fine. But inside, something had gone terribly silent. Not loud pain. Not panic. Silence. The kind that creeps in when you've postponed yourself for too long. When every important decision in your life was made by asking, what's reasonable, instead of, what's true. I remember the exact moment I realized I was living someone else's life. It was an ordinary morning. The kind that feels interchangeable with 100 others. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, toothbrush in hand, staring at my reflection like it belonged to a stranger who had memorized my face. I looked functional. Healthy. Awake. But I felt absent. I tried to remember when I had last made a choice that scared me. A choice that wasn't safe, approved, efficient. I couldn't find one. My memory offered deadlines, obligations, plans made out of duty. Not desire. That morning, something cracked, not violently, but irrevocably. A quiet understanding settled in. If I continued like this, I would reach the end of my life without ever having met myself. Most people don't collapse when they realize that. They adapt. They numb. They distract. I tried all of that. I worked harder. I stayed busier. I told myself that fulfillment was overrated, that stability was the real prize. But at night, when the world softened and no one needed anything from me, the silence returned. It asked questions I didn't want to answer. Who would you be if no one was watching? Who would you become if you stopped performing competence? How much of your life is habit, and how much is fear? I began fantasizing about disappearance, not death. Never death. Just absence. The idea of stepping sideways out of my own life. Letting it continue without me while I started somewhere unnamed, unclaimed. At first, it felt like an escape fantasy. Harmless. A mental vacation. Then it started feeling necessary. I noticed how often people spoke to me without actually seeing me. How easily my presence could be replaced by a role. If I missed a meeting, someone else filled the chair. If I didn't call, life continued. The world was not balanced on my participation. That realization should have terrified me. Instead, it felt like relief. I tested my disappearance in small ways. I stopped answering messages immediately. I canceled plans with vague excuses. I allowed relationships to loosen without tightening them again. No one confronted me. No one asked if I was okay. That hurt more than I expected. It confirmed what I was afraid of. I wasn't essential. I was convenient. And convenience is easy to abandon. The day I left wasn't planned with precision. There was no countdown. I woke up with the familiar heaviness in my chest and understood that if I didn't go that day, I never would. Courage, I learned, is sometimes just exhaustion reaching its limit. I packed a bag without sentimentality. Clothes without memories. Objects without history. I left behind everything that tied me to expectations I could no longer meet. I didn't leave a note. Not because I didn't care, but because I couldn't explain a disappearance that didn't come from hatred or grief. How do you tell people you're leaving because staying has erased you? I walked out into a world that had no idea it was losing me. The first days felt unreal. Like walking through a city after a storm, when everything looks familiar but sounds different. I kept waiting for guilt to crush me, for panic to chase me back. Instead, I felt something closer to vertigo. Freedom is disorienting when you're not used to choosing. Without a schedule imposed by others, time stretched unnaturally. Mornings didn't demand productivity. Evenings didn't punish me for idleness. I existed without being evaluated. And that's when the real breakdown began. Because once the noise faded, there was nothing left to distract me from myself. I had thought leaving would give me clarity, direction, answers. What it gave me was exposure. I realized how little I knew about what I actually wanted. Not what impressed others. Not what looked respectable. What sustained me. What made life feel inhabited instead of tolerated. I had built my identity on being reliable, reasonable, composed. Strip that away, and there was a hollow space underneath. No script. No applause. No next step. Some nights, I lay awake wondering if I had made the worst mistake of my life. I imagined the concern I had caused, the confusion, the quiet anger. I imagined being spoken about in past tense, not because I was dead, but because I had chosen to leave. Disappearance has a cost. You don't just lose people. You lose your reflection in their eyes. You lose the version of yourself that existed only because someone else believed in it. But you also gain something dangerous. Honesty. With no one to impress, I could no longer lie about my emptiness. I couldn't hide behind competence or usefulness. I had to confront the question I had avoided for years: if no one expects anything from you, who are you willing to become? That question haunted me. And it demanded an answer. The hardest part of disappearing isn't loneliness. It's responsibility. When no one knows where you are, every choice becomes undeniably yours. There's no one to blame for a wasted day. No structure to lean on. No narrative to hide behind. Freedom stops feeling poetic and starts feeling heavy. I learned quickly that escape doesn't erase you. It only removes witnesses. In the beginning, I moved often. Not because I was chased, but because stillness scared me. I stayed in places where my name didn't matter. Cafes where no one remembered my order. Streets where my footsteps blended with everyone else's. I liked being anonymous. It felt like a clean slate. But a clean slate is also blank. Days blurred together. I woke when I wanted. Ate when I remembered. Slept when exhaustion finally caught me. Without deadlines, time lost its edges. Weeks passed without milestones. At first, it felt like rest. Then it felt like drifting. That's when the thoughts returned. Not loud ones. Not dramatic ones. Just persistent, quiet reflections that refused to be ignored. What if you were wrong? What if leaving didn't fix anything? What if this is all you are without structure? I realized how much of my confidence had been borrowed from routine. From recognition. From being needed. Without those mirrors, my sense of self flickered. Some evenings, I caught myself rehearsing explanations I would never give. Imagined conversations where I justified my disappearance. Not to them, but to myself. I told myself I had needed this. That staying would have killed me slowly. That starting over required destruction first. But doubt is patient. It waits for silence. One night, I broke down in a room that wasn't mine, staring at a ceiling I didn't recognize. The tears surprised me. I hadn't felt sad. I hadn't felt anything strongly for a long time. But the emotion came anyway, uninvited, uncontrollable. I cried for the life I had abandoned. Not because it was perfect, but because it had been familiar. I cried for the people who would never get an explanation that made sense. I cried for the version of me who had believed endurance was the same as purpose. That night, I understood something important: disappearing doesn't make you brave. Facing yourself does. And I hadn't been doing that. I had changed locations, not patterns. I had removed obligations, not fears. I was still avoiding the same questions, just in different places. So I stopped running. Not back. Just inward. I forced myself into uncomfortable stillness. I created small rules. Wake up at the same time. Walk without headphones. Sit with thoughts instead of outrunning them. Write, not for anyone else, but to hear my own voice again. What emerged wasn't a grand revelation. It was disappointment. I discovered how ordinary my desires were. I didn't crave greatness. I didn't want reinvention through spectacle. I wanted meaning without performance. Work that didn't hollow me out. Relationships that didn't require constant translation of myself. I wanted a life that felt inhabited. That realization was both comforting and devastating. Comforting, because it meant fulfillment wasn't some unreachable ideal. Devastating, because I had sacrificed everything chasing approval instead. I began to see my old life with brutal clarity. How often I had said yes to avoid conflict. How frequently I had postponed joy until some undefined later. How deeply I had confused responsibility with virtue. I wasn't trapped back then. I was compliant. And compliance, when practiced long enough, becomes invisible self-betrayal. Slowly, painfully, I started rebuilding, not a new identity, but an honest one. I took work that didn't impress anyone. I learned to be bad at things again. To ask questions without pretending I already knew the answers. There was humility in that. And grief. Because growth doesn't erase regret. It sharpens it. Some nights, guilt returned with force. I imagined birthdays missed. Emergencies I wouldn't know about. The ache of being remembered without context. I wondered if my disappearance had caused more harm than my quiet despair ever did. There's no moral clarity in leaving. You don't get labeled hero or villain. You exist in a gray space of unresolved consequences. You live with the knowledge that your healing may have been someone else's confusion. I had to decide whether that cost was acceptable. That decision haunted me more than fear ever had. Because restarting your life isn't about finding happiness. It's about choosing which pain you're willing to live with. The pain of staying. Or the pain of leaving. I didn't have a perfect answer. I still don't. But one morning, as I watched sunlight spill across a table where I had nothing urgent to do and no one to perform for, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not joy. Alignment. For the first time in years, my thoughts didn't contradict my actions. My days didn't require justification. I wasn't pretending to be okay, I simply was, in a quiet, fragile way. That was when I understood, starting over isn't about erasing the past. It's about finally stopping the lies you tell yourself to survive it. And that truth prepared me for the hardest question of all. Could I ever be seen again, without losing myself? The idea of being seen again terrified me more than disappearing ever had. When you vanish, people fill the silence with their own versions of you. When you return, if you return, you disrupt those stories. You force truth into places where imagination has already settled. I didn't know if I was strong enough for that. For a long time, I lived as if my former life existed in a sealed room behind me. I didn't look back often. Not because I had made peace with it, but because I hadn't. Avoidance masqueraded as acceptance. It worked, until it didn't. There came a day when anonymity stopped feeling like freedom and started feeling like exile. I realized I was building another quiet cage. A smaller one, maybe. A gentler one. But a cage nonetheless. I had traded expectation for invisibility, and invisibility, too, can erase you if you let it. The difference was this time, I noticed. Growth doesn't arrive with fireworks. It shows up as discomfort you no longer ignore. I began asking myself questions I had once considered dangerous. What do you owe the people you left behind? What do you owe yourself now? Is disappearance an act of honesty, or unfinished fear? The answers were not clean. They conflicted. They refused simplicity. I understood then that my story was not about escape. It was about avoidance, first of others, then of accountability. And accountability, I learned, is not about punishment. It's about presence. You cannot fully live a life you're afraid to stand behind. That realization didn't send me running back with apologies rehearsed and explanations prepared. Real life is quieter than redemption fantasies. There was no dramatic reunion waiting for me. No guarantee of forgiveness. No promise that returning, emotionally or physically, would heal what had been fractured. But I stopped hiding. I allowed myself to exist without secrecy. I let people know me where I was, not where I had been. I stopped inventing narratives that made my disappearance sound noble or tragic. I owned it as what it was, a choice made by someone who didn't know how to live honestly yet. That ownership changed everything. Because once you stop defending your past, it loses its power to define you. I still carry regret. Anyone who tells you they don't is either lying or numb. I regret not speaking sooner. Not asking for help when silence first crept in. Not trusting that vulnerability could have saved me from erasure. But regret is no longer my compass. Meaning doesn't come from flawless decisions. It comes from conscious ones. I learned that restarting your life isn't a reset button. It's a responsibility. You don't get a new soul. You bring the same one with you, wounded, wiser, still capable of repeating old mistakes if you're not paying attention. The second chance isn't in the escape. It's in awareness. Today, my life looks simple. Almost unremarkable. And for the first time, that doesn't scare me. I don't need it to be impressive. I need it to be true. My days no longer revolve around who I should be, but around who I am willing to take care of. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the version of me who stood in front of that bathroom mirror years ago, toothbrush in hand, feeling absent in their own body. I wish I could speak to them. I wouldn't tell them to leave. I wouldn't tell them to stay. I would tell them this: disappearing won't save you. Neither will endurance. Only honesty will. Honesty about what hurts. Honesty about what you want. Honesty about the cost of every path you choose. Because every life charges a price. The tragedy is not paying it consciously. I didn't disappear to find freedom. I disappeared to hear myself think. And what I learned is that identity isn't something you escape into, it's something you build by choosing presence over fear, again and again. If you're listening to this and you feel that same quiet erosion I once did, know this: you don't need to erase yourself to start over. You only need to stop abandoning yourself in small ways. That's where disappearing truly begins. And that's where it must end.